It's the year 1118, and the holiest city in the world has become a death trap. Jerusalem, freshly conquered by Christian crusaders just 19 years earlier, should have been a beacon of hope for faithful pilgrims making their sacred journey. Instead, it was a nightmare waiting to happen. The roads leading to the Holy Land were soaked in blood. Bandits lurked behind every rocky outcrop, waiting to pounce on defenseless travelers carrying their life savings to visit the places where Christ once walked. Muslim raiders struck without warning, and even local Christians sometimes turned predator when desperation called. Pilgrims who had sold everything they owned, who had walked hundreds of miles with nothing but faith in their hearts, were being slaughtered within sight of their destination. Now imagine you're a knight named Hugues de Payens. You're not some wealthy lord with vast estates. You're actually pretty much landless, a minor nobleman from the Champagne region of France who's seen too much violence, too much senseless death. Maybe you've done things in battle that keep you awake at night. Maybe you're carrying guilt that feels heavier than your armor. One day, you're standing in the shadow of Solomon's temple, or what's left of it, watching yet another group of pilgrims nervously eyeing the dangerous road ahead. Their fear is palpable. Some are praying, some are weeping, knowing they might not see their families again. And something inside you just breaks. This is the moment that would change history forever. Hugues de Payens didn't wake up one morning planning to create the most powerful military organization of the Middle Ages. He simply couldn't stand watching innocent people die anymore. So he gathered 8 other knights. Just 8, can you believe that? 9 men total, most of them as landless and haunted as himself. They were Geoffrey de Saint-Omer, Payen de Montdidier, Archambault de Saint-Agnan, André de Montbard, Gondemar, Rosal, Godefroy, and Geoffrey Bissol. These weren't the cream of European nobility. They were men with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. Together they made an oath that must have sounded completely insane to anyone listening. They swore to live in poverty. Imagine that, knights voluntarily giving up wealth. They vowed to remain celibate, warriors choosing to never marry or have families. And most shocking of all, they promised to dedicate their lives to protecting pilgrims on the treacherous roads to Jerusalem. Think about how radical this was. Knights were supposed to fight for glory, for land, for their lords. They were supposed to accumulate wealth and power. But here were 9 men saying, "We'll fight for strangers. We'll risk our lives for people we'll never meet, and we'll do it for free." King Baldwin II of Jerusalem, probably thinking these guys were either saints or completely mad, gave them permission to set up headquarters in the most sacred spot imaginable, right on the Temple Mount, in the ruins of Solomon's temple itself. Can you picture it? 9 knights living in the remnants of the place where ancient kings once worshipped, surrounded by the echoes of 3,000 years of prayer and power. For their first 9 years, think about this, there were still only 9 of them. 9 men trying to patrol hundreds of miles of bandit-infested roads. It sounds impossible, doesn't it? Some historians even wonder if protecting pilgrims was really their only mission, or if they were searching for something else entirely in those ancient ruins beneath their feet. But here's what made them different from every other military group of their time. They truly lived what they preached. While other knights flaunted their wealth with elaborate armor and fine horses, the Templars wore simple white mantles. They ate together, prayed together, and when they rode out to face danger, they did it knowing they had absolutely nothing to gain except the satisfaction of keeping innocent people alive. Word began to spread across Europe about these strange warrior monks. Stories filtered back about knights who would rather die than abandon a pilgrim caravan. Tales of men who fought like demons in battle but spent their evenings in prayer. People started calling them the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. Quite a mouthful, but it captured exactly what they were. Poor by choice, soldiers by necessity, and servants of something greater than themselves. What Hugues de Payens and his 8 companions didn't realize was that their simple, desperate decision to protect strangers would grow into something that would reshape medieval Europe, revolutionize banking, and create legends that would outlive them all by centuries. But that transformation was still years away. In 1118, they were just 9 men with worn swords and unshakable faith, standing guard on the bloodiest roads in Christendom. Let me tell you about the cruel irony that defined the Holy Land in the early 12th century. The First Crusade had ended in 1099 with Christian knights triumphantly capturing Jerusalem, but what should have been a golden age for Christian pilgrims became their darkest nightmare. Picture the contradiction. European priests were preaching from their pulpits about the glorious liberation of the Holy Land, painting images of peaceful pilgrimage to the sites where Christ walked. Faithful Christians sold their homes, their livestock, everything they owned, believing they were embarking on the journey of a lifetime to touch the very stones where Jesus prayed. Yet the reality waiting for them was something straight out of hell. The roads to Jerusalem had become rivers of blood. What the Crusaders had liberated was actually a war-torn landscape where survival depended on luck, cunning, and the mercy of strangers who rarely showed any. The irony was devastating. People were dying horrific deaths while trying to reach the place that promised them eternal salvation. Think about this. A peasant family from northern France would spend months walking toward the Holy Land, their hearts full of hope and their purses carrying their life savings. They'd finally see the walls of Jerusalem glinting in the distance, knowing they were just hours away from fulfilling their greatest dream. Then, in a matter of minutes, bandits would emerge from the rocky hills and transform their pilgrimage into a massacre. But let me make this real for you through the story of one man whose letters survived the centuries. Jean de Milan was a cloth merchant from a small town near Paris. He wasn't wealthy, but he'd saved enough coins over the years to take his wife Marie and their 2 young children on pilgrimage to the Holy City. His letters to his brother back home tell a story that will break your heart. In his first letter, written from Constantinople, Jean is bubbling with excitement. He describes the magnificent churches they've seen, the kindness of fellow pilgrims, and how his 6-year-old daughter keeps asking if they'll really see where Jesus was born. He writes about sharing bread with a family from Germany, and how amazing it feels to be part of something so much bigger than his little cloth shop. His second letter, written from Antioch, shows the first cracks of doubt. Jean mentions that several pilgrim groups ahead of them simply vanished. Local Christians whisper warnings about certain mountain passes, about bands of raiders who show no mercy to anyone carrying coins or valuable possessions. But Jean tries to stay positive. After all, they've come so far, and God will surely protect them on their sacred mission. The third letter never reached his brother. We only have it because it was found clutched in Jean's dying hand by other pilgrims who discovered the massacre site 3 days later. In that final blood-stained letter, Jean describes the attack with heartbreaking detail. It happened just 2 hours outside Jerusalem, so close they could see the golden dome catching the morning sunlight. The bandits weren't foreign raiders or Muslim fighters seeking revenge for the Crusades. They were local men, some even wearing Christian crosses, who had turned to highway robbery because it was easier than farming the war-torn land. Jean writes about how his wife tried to hide their children behind their donkey when the attackers appeared. He describes the terrible choice he faced: hand over their money and probably be killed anyway, or fight with his eating knife against armed men and definitely watch his family die. He chose to fight. The letter ends with Jean, mortally wounded, writing his final words: "Tell my brother the Holy Land is holy, but the roads to reach it are cursed. We came seeking God and found only death. If others follow, tell them to bring armies, not prayers." This wasn't an isolated incident. Historians estimate that for every 10 pilgrims who set out for Jerusalem in those early years after the First Crusade, only 6 or 7 actually made it alive to the city gates. The others became statistics in a tragedy that church leaders back in Europe either didn't understand or chose to ignore. The worst part was the randomness of it all. Wealth didn't guarantee safety. Rich pilgrims were bigger targets. Traveling in large groups sometimes helped, but it also attracted more attention from larger bands of raiders. Some pilgrims tried disguising themselves as merchants or paupers, but desperation made predators hunt anything that moved. And here's what made it even more heartbreaking. Many of these attacks happened within sight of Jerusalem itself. Families would spend months dreaming of that moment when they'd finally see the holy city, only to die with their destination literally visible on the horizon. The psychological cruelty was almost worse than the physical violence. The Christian nobles who controlled Jerusalem knew about the problem, but they were too busy fighting each other and defending against Muslim armies to spare soldiers for escort duty. Besides, most of them saw pilgrims as a source of income when they reached the city, not as people worth protecting on the dangerous journey there. This was the blood-soaked reality that Hugues de Payens and his 8 companions witnessed day after day. They watched good people, farmers, merchants, craftsmen, entire families, arrive in Jerusalem as broken survivors or not arrive at all. They saw the terrible gap between the promise of safe pilgrimage and the brutal truth of bandit-controlled roads. And that's exactly why 9 knights decided they couldn't just stand by and watch anymore. Here's something that might surprise you about Hugues de Payens. He wasn't the kind of hero you'd expect to find in medieval legends. When we think of knights founding great orders, we usually picture powerful lords with vast estates and gleaming armor. But Hugo was what medieval society called a landless knight, basically a warrior without property, without wealth, and without the respect that came with either. Hugo came from the Champagne region of France, and while his family had noble blood, they didn't have much else. He'd spent years fighting in various conflicts, probably including the brutal aftermath of the First Crusade, and there's something in the historical records that suggests he carried deep guilt about his past. We don't know exactly what happened. Maybe he'd killed innocent people in the heat of battle. Maybe he'd abandoned comrades when things got desperate. Or maybe he'd simply seen too much death and felt responsible for not preventing it. What we do know is that Hugo wasn't driven by glory or ambition. He was driven by something much more powerful and much more dangerous: the need for redemption. The 8 men who joined him weren't exactly the cream of European nobility either. Geoffrey de Saint-Omer was a minor lord from Flanders, who'd lost most of his lands in family disputes. Payen de Montdidier was a younger son with no inheritance coming his way. André de Montbar was actually related to the famous Bernard of Clairvaux, but that connection hadn't brought him wealth or status. These were men who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. They were the kind of knights that established nobles looked down on, warriors without proper backing, without great family names, without the political connections that mattered in medieval society. In other words, they were perfect for a mission that seemed impossible. But here's where their story gets really interesting, and really controversial. When Hugo and his companions approached King Baldwin II of Jerusalem with their plan, they weren't just asking permission to protect pilgrims. They were proposing something that had never existed before: a military order that combined the vows of monks with the violence of knights. Think about how radical this was. Monks were supposed to pray, fast, and copy manuscripts. Knights were supposed to fight, accumulate wealth, and serve earthly lords. But these 9 men were saying they wanted to do both: to take vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience like monks, while also carrying swords and engaging in deadly combat like professional warriors. The church was deeply suspicious of this idea. Bishops and abbots had spent centuries trying to control the violence of knights, and now here were warriors who wanted to make violence part of their religious devotion. How could you serve the Prince of Peace while splitting skulls with a battle axe? How could you take vows of humility while wearing armor designed to intimidate enemies? Many religious leaders thought Hugo and his companions were either deluded or dangerous. Some whispered that they were trying to use religion as a cover for banditry. Others worried that mixing warfare with religious vows would corrupt both institutions. But King Baldwin, facing the daily reality of murdered pilgrims and impossible-to-patrol roads, decided to take a chance on these 9 strange knights. He gave them permission to live in the ruins of Solomon's Temple, hence their eventual name, the Knights of the Temple, or Templars. Now here's a fascinating contradiction that perfectly captures the complexity of these men. They took vows of poverty, absolutely refusing to own personal property or accumulate wealth. Yet they chose to wear distinctive white mantles that made them stand out dramatically on the battlefield. Why white? In medieval warfare, most knights wore whatever colors represented their family or lord. Browns, greens, and dark blues were common because they were practical and didn't show dirt or blood easily. But white was different. White was the color of purity, of angels, of divine intervention. It was also completely impractical. White clothing showed every stain, every tear, every drop of blood. The Templars chose white specifically because it made them visible. They wanted their enemies to see them coming. They wanted fellow Christians to recognize them instantly, and they wanted everyone to understand that these weren't ordinary mercenaries fighting for pay. These were men who believed they were doing God's work, and they were proud of it. But there's something almost contradictory about taking vows of humility and then wearing garments designed to make you the center of attention on every battlefield. It was as if they were saying, "We own nothing and want nothing for ourselves, but we absolutely want you to know who we are when we're saving your life." This contradiction ran through everything they did. They slept on simple straw mats but maintained their weapons with obsessive care. They ate plain bread and water but trained constantly to become the most feared fighting force in the Holy Land. They owned no personal possessions, but gradually accumulated resources for their mission that would eventually rival the treasuries of kings. The other knights in Jerusalem didn't know what to make of them. Here were 9 men who'd voluntarily given up everything that made knighthood worthwhile: land, wealth, families, personal glory. Yet they carried themselves with more confidence than lords who owned entire counties. They'd become beggars by choice, but they fought like men who had nothing to fear because they truly had nothing to lose. And here's something that will blow your mind. These 9 knights who took vows of poverty and initially lived on donated bread and water would eventually create Europe's first international banking system. They'd develop financial innovations that are still used today, become advisors to kings and popes, and accumulate wealth that would make them targets of envy and fear across the known world. But in 1118, they were just 9 flawed men trying to do something good in a world that seemed determined to punish goodness. They were heroes, yes, but imperfect ones, driven by guilt, motivated by redemption, and willing to risk everything for strangers they'd never meet. Did you know that the Templars created the first banking system in Europe? If you're enjoying this deep dive into medieval history, hit that like button, share this video with your history-loving friends, and let me know in the comments. Would you trust your wealth to a military order? Picture this scene. Somewhere in the shadowy scriptorium of Clairvaux Abbey, candlelight flickers across parchment as the most influential monk in Europe puts quill to ink. The year is 1128. And Bernard of Clairvaux, a man whose words could topple kings and launch crusades, is writing what would become one of the most mysterious documents in medieval history. But this isn't just any religious text. Bernard is crafting the secret rule that will govern every aspect of a Templar's life, from the moment he wakes until he closes his eyes at night. And some of what he's writing is so strange, so unexpected, that even today historians scratch their heads trying to understand the reasoning behind it. Let me set the scene for you. Outside the monastery walls, church bells toll the hours as they have for centuries, their bronze voices carrying across valleys, where peasants work fields that haven't changed since Charlemagne's time. Inside the scriptorium, monk scribes work by the light of beeswax candles, their faces ghostly pale as they carefully copy sacred texts. The air smells of parchment, ink, and the faint smoke from oil lamps that never quite burn cleanly. But Bernard isn't copying an ancient text. He's creating something entirely new. He's trying to solve an impossible puzzle. How do you write rules for men who are both monks and warriors? How do you create guidelines for people who must pray in the morning and potentially kill in the afternoon? The basic structure of the rule made sense. The Templars would pray at specific hours, just like other monks. They'd eat simple food, sleep on hard beds, and own no personal possessions. But then Bernard started adding provisions that were so specific, so bizarre, that they reveal just how worried he was about what these warrior monks might become. Here's where it gets really strange. Bernard wrote that a Templar knight was forbidden from kissing any woman. Not his sister, not his mother, not even his own daughter if he'd had one before taking vows. Think about that for a moment. In medieval society, kissing family members was a normal sign of affection and respect. A son not kissing his mother would have been seen as deeply unnatural. Yet Bernard was so concerned about Templars maintaining their purity that he banned even the most innocent family affection. But it gets weirder. The rules stated that Templars couldn't be alone with women, couldn't talk to women without witnesses present, and couldn't even look directly at women for extended periods. Bernard was essentially trying to create men who existed in a world without half the human population. Now you might think this was just typical medieval religious extremism, but remember, these weren't monastery monks who'd chosen a life of complete separation from the world. These were men who had to travel constantly, interact with local populations, and often stay in towns and cities where women lived and worked. Bernard was asking them to navigate medieval society while following rules that made normal human interaction nearly impossible. The restrictions on physical comfort were equally extreme. Templars couldn't bathe regularly, which in an age when most people rarely bathed anyway might not seem like much. But for men wearing heavy armor in the desert heat of the Holy Land, this was genuine torture. They couldn't sleep in soft beds, couldn't eat meat more than 3 times a week, and were required to maintain absolute silence during meals. Here's a detail that shows just how controlling the rule was. Bernard specified exactly how Templars should cut their hair and trim their beards. He dictated what they could wear under their armor, how they should sit during prayers, and even how they should walk, apparently with heads slightly bowed and eyes focused on the ground ahead of them, never looking around curiously or appearing proud. But perhaps the strangest provision was about friendship. The rule explicitly forbade Templars from forming close personal bonds with each other. They were supposed to be brothers in arms, yes, but not friends in the way we understand friendship. Bernard was worried that personal loyalties might interfere with obedience to the order, so he tried to create an organization of men who would fight and die for each other, but never truly know each other. Think about the psychological impact of this. These men were already isolated from their families, forbidden from romantic relationships, and now they weren't even allowed to form deep friendships with the people they lived and fought beside every day. Bernard was essentially trying to create perfect soldiers by making them perfect loners. The rule also contained provisions about hunting that reveal medieval attitudes toward class and violence. Templars were forbidden from hunting with hawks or hounds, activities that were considered noble pastimes, but they were encouraged to hunt lions. Yes, you heard that right. They couldn't chase rabbits for sport, but they were supposed to actively seek out and kill lions because lions were seen as symbols of pride and aggression that needed to be eliminated. Now imagine being one of the original 9 Templars and receiving this document. You've been living relatively simply in Jerusalem for about 10 years, making up your own rules as you go along, focused mainly on the practical business of keeping pilgrims alive. Suddenly, you're handed dozens of pages of incredibly detailed regulations that govern everything from how you eat your bread to how you lace your boots. Some of the original Templars probably wondered if Bernard had lost his mind. Others might have seen the wisdom in creating such detailed guidelines. After all, they were growing from 9 men to dozens, and soon there would be hundreds of Templars scattered across Europe and the Holy Land. Without clear rules, the order might fragment or lose its purpose. But here's what's really fascinating about the secret rule. It worked. Despite its bizarre restrictions and seemingly impossible demands, men flocked to join the Templars. The combination of rigid discipline and holy purpose attracted knights from across Europe who were looking for something more meaningful than the endless petty wars and political scheming of feudal society. The rule created men who were absolutely devoted to their mission, utterly disciplined in their behavior, and completely unified in their purpose. It also created men who were somewhat inhuman, isolated from normal emotional connections, trained to see the world in terms of absolute good and evil, and conditioned to follow orders without question. Bernard's secret rule transformed Hugues de Payens' small band of knights into something that medieval Europe had never seen before, a religious military machine that answered to no earthly authority except the Pope himself. And that transformation would have consequences that none of them could have imagined. By 1129, something extraordinary and terrifying had happened to Hugues de Payens' small band of knights. What had started as 9 desperate men trying to protect pilgrims had grown into something that made kings nervous and popes take notice. The Templars had discovered something that would change their destiny forever. Good intentions, when backed by absolute dedication, can accumulate power faster than anyone expects. Here's the cruel irony that would define the rest of Templar history. They had taken vows of personal poverty. Not one of them could own so much as a silver coin for himself. Yet collectively, they were becoming incredibly wealthy. Every grateful pilgrim who survived the journey to Jerusalem because of Templar protection wanted to show their appreciation. Grateful families donated land, money, livestock, and precious objects to the order. Kings and nobles, impressed by their discipline and effectiveness, began granting them estates and tax exemptions. But here's what made the situation really complicated. The Templars genuinely needed these resources to do their job. Maintaining knights in the field was expensive. Horses, armor, weapons, food, and supplies for men scattered across thousands of miles of hostile territory. The more successful they became at protecting pilgrims, the more pilgrims came, and the more resources they needed to protect even larger numbers of people. It was a snowball effect that nobody had planned for. The Templars were trapped in a cycle where their success demanded more resources. But accumulating those resources made them look less like humble servants of God and more like a powerful organization with its own agenda. Picture the scene in 1129 at the Council of Troy. The most important religious and political leaders in Europe have gathered in this French town to make a decision that will reshape the medieval world. Pope Honorius II has sent representatives. Bernard of Clairvaux is there with his influential voice, and dozens of bishops, abbots, and nobles fill the great hall. Hugues de Payens stands before them, no longer the landless knight who had made a desperate oath 11 years earlier. He's now the Grand Master of an organization that owns properties from England to Jerusalem, that commands the loyalty of hundreds of knights, and that has become essential to the survival of the Crusader states. But he's still wearing that simple white mantle, still claiming to own nothing personally, still insisting that everything the Templars do is for the protection of innocent pilgrims. The question hanging in the air is this: are the Templars still the humble servants they claim to be, or have they become something else entirely? Are they justice or fanaticism? Are they protectors or predators? Some of the nobles at the council were deeply suspicious. Here was a military organization that answered only to the Pope, that was accumulating wealth and land at an incredible rate, and that was filled with knights who had no family loyalties, no local obligations, and no earthly desires except to serve their order. In a world where power was carefully balanced between competing interests, the Templars were becoming an unpredictable force that couldn't be controlled through the normal mechanisms of medieval politics. Others saw them as the answer to Christianity's prayers. The Crusader states were constantly under attack. Pilgrims were still dying on dangerous roads, and the Templars had proven they could actually solve these problems. They were disciplined, effective, and genuinely committed to their mission. If they were accumulating wealth and power, it was only because they needed both to protect the weak. The debate must have been intense. Imagine the arguments echoing through that medieval hall. These men have saved thousands of lives, versus these men are becoming too powerful to trust. The political implications were staggering. If the Church officially recognized the Templars, it would be creating a precedent for military orders that could operate across national boundaries without interference from local authorities. When the council finally made its decision, it seemed like a complete victory for the Templars. They officially recognized the order, approved Bernard's rule, and granted the Templars privileges that were almost unprecedented. The Templars could collect their own taxes. They were exempt from paying tithes to local churches. They could build their own churches and bury their own dead, and they answered directly to the Pope rather than to local bishops or secular authorities. But here's the tragic irony that nobody at the Council of Troyes understood at the time. They weren't just legitimizing the Templars, they were signing their eventual death warrant. Think about what they had just created. The Templars were now a state within states, an organization with international reach, independent financing, and military power that couldn't be controlled by any earthly authority except the Pope. They had become exactly the kind of organization that ambitious rulers would eventually see as a threat rather than an asset. The very privileges that made the Templars effective also made them dangerous. Their exemption from local taxes meant they competed unfairly with local merchants and landowners. Their independent military strength meant they could potentially challenge secular authorities. Their direct relationship with the Pope meant they could ignore local laws and customs whenever it suited their purposes. Within just a few decades, the Templars would become so wealthy that they'd be lending money to kings. They'd develop banking systems that allowed a pilgrim to deposit money in London and withdraw it in Jerusalem. They'd own fleets of ships, vast agricultural estates, and urban properties in every major city in Europe. They'd become advisors to rulers, diplomats in international negotiations, and power brokers whose opinions could influence the fate of nations. But every silver coin they accumulated, every castle they built, every privilege they exercised, would create new enemies. Kings would begin to resent their independence. Local nobles would envy their wealth. Merchants would complain about their unfair advantages. And eventually, someone would decide that the Templars had grown too powerful for their own good, or for anyone else's good. The Council of Troyes had solved the immediate problem of legitimizing a group of knights who wanted to protect pilgrims. But in doing so, they had created a much larger problem. What do you do with an organization that becomes too successful for its own survival? Hugues de Payens left the council as the officially recognized leader of a papal military order, with unprecedented privileges and growing wealth. He probably thought he had secured the future of his mission to protect innocent pilgrims. What he had actually done was set in motion the forces that would, less than 2 centuries later, destroy everything he had built. The price of power, it turns out, is that eventually someone else will want to take it away from you. And the more successfully you accumulate power for good purposes, the more dangerous you become to people who might want to use that power for other purposes entirely. So here we are, at the end of our journey through the founding of the most legendary military order in history. And what a strange, tragic, and ultimately human story it's been. The Templars were born from the purest of intentions, 9 knights who couldn't stand watching innocent people die on the roads to the Holy Land. They created an organization built on sacrifice, discipline, and genuine service to others. They saved thousands of lives, revolutionized medieval banking, and became the backbone of Christian defense in the East. But here's the heartbreaking truth about their story. They were destroyed by their own success. The very qualities that made them heroes, their effectiveness, their independence, their accumulated resources, eventually made them targets. By 1307, less than 2 centuries after Hugues de Payens made his simple oath to protect pilgrims, the last Grand Master of the Templars would be burned at the stake in Paris, and their great experiment would be over. Think about the bitter irony of it all. The Templars were founded to serve others, but they were ultimately betrayed by the very system they had served so faithfully. They accumulated wealth only to fund their mission, but that wealth became the excuse for their destruction. They gained privileges from the church to better protect pilgrims, but those privileges made kings jealous enough to orchestrate their downfall. Their story reminds us of something profound about human nature and power. Even the most noble ideals can be corrupted by success, or more accurately, noble ideals can be destroyed by people who fear that success. The Templars weren't brought down by their own corruption. Most historians agree that the charges against them were largely fabricated. They were brought down because they had become inconveniently powerful in a world where power was supposed to belong to kings and popes, not to independent organizations with their own agendas. But maybe that's not the whole story. Maybe there's another way to look at what Hugues de Payens and his 8 companions accomplished in 1118. When Hugo made that desperate decision to protect strangers on dangerous roads, he probably never imagined that his choice would echo through centuries. He couldn't have known that his simple white mantle would become one of the most recognizable symbols in history, or that his military order would inspire countless other organizations dedicated to service and sacrifice. The Templars may have been destroyed, but the idea they represented, that ordinary people can band together to protect the innocent, that individual sacrifice can serve a greater good, that justice is worth fighting for even when the odds are impossible, that idea survived their destruction and continues to inspire people today. Hugues de Payens died in 1136, just 7 years after the Council of Troyes legitimized his order. He lived long enough to see his small band of knights grow into a powerful international organization, but he died before their great wealth and political influence made them targets for destruction. In a way, maybe that was a mercy. He got to see his dream realized without witnessing its nightmare. But here's the question that haunts anyone who studies Templar history. Was Hugues de Payens really a hero who changed history through moral courage? Or was he just an unwitting pawn in a much larger game of medieval politics? Was the founding of the Templars a genuine grassroots movement of knights who wanted to do good? Or were powerful people already manipulating events behind the scenes? Some historians argue that the church and certain nobles were looking for exactly the kind of military organization that the Templars became, and that Hugo's mission was encouraged and shaped by forces he never fully understood. Others maintain that the Templars' story really did begin with 9 sincere knights making an authentic moral choice, and that their later political entanglements were unintended consequences of their success. The truth, as usual, is probably somewhere in between. Hugues de Payens was almost certainly sincere in his desire to protect pilgrims. The historical evidence supports that. But he was also operating in a world where powerful institutions were constantly looking for ways to extend their influence, and his small band of knights perfectly served the Church's need for a reliable military force in the Holy Land. What we can say for certain is this: regardless of whether larger forces were at work, Hugo and his companions made a choice that required real courage, real sacrifice, and real commitment to something greater than themselves. They gave up personal wealth, family life, and individual ambition to serve strangers they would never meet. That's heroic by any reasonable definition, even if they were also serving purposes they didn't fully understand. Their story teaches us that good intentions, even when backed by genuine sacrifice, aren't enough to guarantee a happy ending. It shows us that success can be as dangerous as failure, that power accumulated for good purposes can still make you enemies, and that serving noble ideals doesn't protect you from the cruel realities of politics and human ambition. But it also shows us that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they're willing to give up everything for something they believe in. 9 knights with no significant resources, no powerful backing, and no clear plan somehow created an organization that would reshape medieval Europe and leave legends that still capture our imagination 7 centuries later. Maybe that's the real legacy of Hugues de Payens and the founding of the Templars, not the wealth they accumulated or the political influence they wielded, but the simple demonstration that individuals who are willing to sacrifice for others can change the world, even if they can't control how that change ultimately unfolds. So what do you think? Was Hugues de Payens a hero who answered a moral calling? Or was he just a man who found himself in the right place at the right time to serve someone else's larger agenda? Was the founding of the Templars a triumph of idealism, or just another example of how noble intentions get swept up in the machinery of power? The answer might depend on how you choose to look at their story, and maybe that's exactly as it should be. After all, the best historical questions don't have simple answers. They make us think about what we would have done in their place, and what lessons their choices might have for our own lives. If you enjoyed diving deep into this incredible story from medieval history, hit that like button and share this video with anyone who loves learning about the past. Subscribe to the Medieval Archives for more stories about the people, events, and ideas that shaped our world. Because history isn't just about what happened. It's about understanding the human choices that made it happen, and what those choices can teach us about ourselves. The Templars may be gone, but their story continues to ask us the questions that matter most. What would you sacrifice for strangers? How much success is too much? And when you're trying to do good in a complicated world, how do you know whether you're a hero or just a pawn in someone else's game?